Listen carefully, France's DGSE. You have been running coup operations across Africa. 4 minutes ago, I released 1,247 pages of classified documents proving France attempted to overthrow Benin's government last month, and I just exposed your entire regime change playbook used across 54 African nations for 65 years. You believed your coup stayed secret because you controlled African media. You were wrong. I captured your operatives. Your plausible deniability just died. You're finished. Let me tell you exactly what happened. On November 12, 2025, Benin security services arrested 14 individuals, including 5 French nationals, 4 Beninese citizens, 3 Togolese nationals, and 2 Nigerian citizens for planning a coup against President Patrice Talon's government. The arrests followed a 6-month surveillance operation by Beninese intelligence working with support from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger through our alliance of Sahel states intelligence sharing network. The surveillance documented meetings between French intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover at France's Cotonou embassy and Beninese military officers recruited to overthrow Talon. The plotters planned to execute the coup on November 28, 2025, during Talon's scheduled visit to northern Benin where security would be reduced. French agents promised plotters immediate diplomatic recognition from France and ECOWAS if coup succeeded, financial support exceeding $50 million to stabilize post-coup government, and military assistance preventing counter-coup attempts by Talon's loyalists. 4 minutes ago, I held press conference in Ouagadougou, where I released complete dossier documenting France's Benin coup attempt, including surveillance recordings of French intelligence officers instructing plotters, financial transaction records showing French government funds transferred to coup organizers through intermediary accounts, WhatsApp message logs between plotters and French handlers discussing operational timeline and contingency plans, and signed agreements between French intelligence and coup leaders guaranteeing French support after successful regime change. I simultaneously released comprehensive analysis showing this Benin operation followed identical pattern France used in 67 documented coup attempts and successful coups across Francophone Africa since 1960, proving France maintained standardized playbook for regime change operations. The documents are now public on Alliance of Sahel States website, distributed to international media, and submitted to United Nations as evidence of French violations of international law prohibiting interference in sovereign nations' internal affairs. France issued immediate denial within 45 minutes, claiming the documents were fabricated, that France does not conduct coup operations, that allegations were politically motivated attempts to damage France-Africa relations, and that France respects African sovereignty and democratic governance. A French foreign ministry spokesperson stated France was a victim of a disinformation campaign orchestrated by Russia and African governments aligned with Russian interests. The French president called the allegations outrageous lies requiring strong response and hinted at potential legal action against me personally for defamation. These denials are standard French responses that they issue after every exposed operation. The denials are lies that French officials know are lies, but issue anyway because Western media typically amplifies French denials rather than investigating evidence. But this time is different because I released actual operational documents rather than just accusations, because evidence is so comprehensive that even Western media cannot ignore it, because multiple African governments are supporting exposure rather than staying silent, and because France's playbook is now public, enabling other African countries to identify and prevent similar operations. France's denial strategy worked for decades when evidence remained classified, and African governments feared French retaliation for exposure. That strategy fails when evidence is published globally and African governments coordinate to expose French interference rather than suffering separately in silence. Listen carefully to what the surveillance operation revealed about France's coup planning methodology. French intelligence identified President Patrice Talon as a target for removal in March 2024 after Talon announced plans to reduce dependence on French imports by diversifying trade relationships with China, Turkey, and other non-Western partners. Talon also expressed interest in joining Alliance of Sahel States as observer member and possibly full member if Benin's economic and security interests aligned with AES priorities. French analysis concluded Talon was moving toward independence from French influence and needed to be replaced with more compliant leadership before Benin followed Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger out of the French sphere of control. French intelligence's first step was identifying potential coup leaders from within Benin's military and political elite who had grievances against Talon's government and would be receptive to French support. France maintains detailed files on military officers, politicians, and business leaders across all Francophone African countries, documenting their backgrounds, ambitions, financial situations, personal weaknesses, and political positions. These files enable France to quickly identify recruitment targets when they decide regime change is necessary. In Benin's case, French intelligence identified Colonel Dieudonné Tévoué-Dré as ideal coup leader because he commanded armored battalions stationed near Cotonou. He had been passed over for promotion by Talon in 2023. He had financial difficulties, including debts exceeding $400,000, and his political views favored maintaining close France-Benin relationships. A French intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover as cultural attaché at France's Cotonou embassy initiated contact with Tévoué-Dré in April 2024 through a seemingly chance encounter at a social function. The officer, whose real name is Captain Laurent Brossard from DGSE's Africa Division, cultivated relationships over several months through additional social meetings, eventually revealing French government's dissatisfaction with Talon and suggesting France would support leadership change. In July 2024, Brossard directly proposed that Tévoué-Dré lead coup with French backing, promising immediate recognition, substantial financial support, and military assistance. Tévoué-Dré agreed after Brossard demonstrated French commitment through initial payment of $200,000 clearing his debts. From August through October 2024, Brossard and Tévoué-Dré recruited additional participants from military units, political opposition, and civil society organizations. They recruited Lieutenant Colonel Maxime Capassignon, who commanded Special Forces Unit, Major Serge Houndecon, who led military intelligence, businessman Pascal Adovielande, who had resources funding operation, and politician Theodore Montero, who would serve as transitional president after coup. Each recruit received financial incentives and promises of positions in post-coup government. The recruitment expanded beyond Benin to include Togolese and Nigerian contacts who could provide logistic support and safe haven if coup failed. The operational plan developed from August through November 2024 followed France's standard coup methodology documented in their classified manual that I obtained through intelligence cooperation with countries France targeted. The plan designated November 28, 2025 as coup date coinciding with Talon's visit to northern Benin. Tévoué-Dré's armored battalion would move from barracks at 3 a.m. under pretext of training exercise, securing presidential palace, national television station, airport, and key government buildings by 6 a.m. before Talon returned from north. Special forces under Capassignon would arrest or neutralize palace guard and prevent counter-coup resistance. Montero would appear on television at 8:00 a.m. announcing formation of National Salvation Council and suspension of constitution. France would issue recognition statement by 10:00 a.m., praising coup as restoration of democracy and offering assistance to transitional government. The plan included contingencies for various scenarios, including Talon returning to Cotonou early, loyal military units resisting coup, and regional countries including Nigeria intervening. French military forces stationed at bases in Gabon and Djibouti would deploy to Benin within 24 hours if requested by coup government, providing air support against loyalist forces and deterring regional intervention. France committed to providing $50 million in immediate budget support, enabling coup government to pay salaries and maintain services. France would pressure ECOWAS to recognize coup government and lift any sanctions within weeks rather than months. Beninese intelligence became aware of coup plotting in May 2024 when military intelligence officer noticed unusual meetings between Tévoué-Dré and French embassy personnel. Initial surveillance documented the recruitment meetings but couldn't confirm French government involvement versus independent conspiracy. Benin's President Talon contacted me in June 2024 requesting assistance because Burkina Faso's experience with French coup attempts provided expertise Benin lacked. I deployed intelligence advisors to Cotonou who helped establish comprehensive surveillance operation monitoring all suspected plotters. The surveillance operation from June through November 2024 used electronic monitoring of phones and messaging apps, physical surveillance of meetings between plotters, planted informants within conspiracy providing real-time updates, and financial tracking following money transfers from French sources to plotters. The operation documented every meeting, recorded hours of conversations, photographed documents, and copied digital files. By November 2024, we had complete picture of conspiracy including participants, timeline, operational plan, French involvement, and financial arrangements. The decision on when to arrest conspirators involved careful calculation balancing multiple factors. Arresting too early would prevent gathering complete evidence documenting full scope of conspiracy and French involvement. Arresting too late risked coup execution, succeeding before intervention. We decided on November 12, 2025 as arrest date, 16 days before planned coup execution, providing sufficient time to prevent coup while allowing complete evidence collection. The timing also provided dramatic revelation before coup attempt rather than after-the-fact exposure. Beninese security services executed coordinated arrests on November 12, 2025 at 4:09 a.m., simultaneously detaining all identified conspirators across multiple locations in Cotonou, Porto Novo, and northern Benin. The operation arrested 14 individuals without firing shots or alerting other potential plotters. Security services seized computers, phones, documents, and financial records, providing additional evidence. French nationals arrested included Captain Brossard, despite diplomatic immunity claims, and 4 other French citizens operating as contractors and advisors. France immediately demanded release of French nationals, claiming diplomatic immunity protected them from arrest. Benin rejected immunity claims because individuals engaged in coup plotting and espionage activities not covered by diplomatic immunity under Vienna Convention. France threatened to sever diplomatic relations if Benin proceeded with prosecutions. Benin responded by expelling France's ambassador and reducing French embassy staff to minimal levels. France suspended development assistance and began coordinating sanctions through ECOWAS against Benin. I intervened publicly on November 14, 2025 by announcing Burkina Faso possessed complete documentation of French coup attempt and would release evidence if France continued threatening Benin. France initially dismissed the threat, believing I was bluffing, but on November 18, 2025, I released initial tranche of documents including audio recordings of Brossard instructing Traoré, proving French intelligence involvement beyond any doubt. The recordings included Brossard speaking in French, discussing operational details, promising specific amounts of financial support, and coordinating with Paris through encrypted communications. France responded with escalated denials, claiming recordings were fabricated using AI technology, that Brossard was rogue officer acting without authorization, and that France would sue for defamation if allegations continued. These responses were desperate attempts at damage control that convinced nobody familiar with intelligence operations. Audio analysis by independent forensic experts confirmed recordings were authentic. Brossard's identity was verified through multiple sources, including French military records. The coordination with Paris was documented through message logs showing instructions from DGSE headquarters. 4 minutes ago, I released the complete dossier containing every piece of evidence collected during 6-month surveillance operation. The dossier includes 1,247 pages of documents, 67 hours of audio recordings, 3,400 WhatsApp messages, 890 emails, financial transaction records tracking $2.3 million in French payments to plotters, video surveillance of meetings, and analytical reports showing this operation followed France's standard playbook. The release is devastating for France because evidence is irrefutable, comprehensive, and demonstrates systematic French interference in African sovereignty rather than isolated incident. Listen carefully to what France's standard coup playbook reveals about their regime change operations across Africa. The playbook exists as classified manual titled Guide opérationnel pour le maintien de l'influence française en Afrique, produced by DGSE's Africa division and updated regularly based on operational experience. I obtained copy of this manual through intelligence sharing with friendly services. The manual is approximately 400 pages long, covering every aspect of coup operations from target selection through post-coup stabilization. The manual's first section covers target identification criteria for determining which African leaders should be removed. Primary criteria include leader expressing interest in reducing French military presence or closing French bases, leader nationalizing industries or resources previously controlled by French companies, leader diversifying international partnerships toward China, Russia, Turkey, or other powers France views as competitors, leader supporting Pan-African initiatives that could reduce French bilateral influence, leader proposing monetary independence from CFA franc system France controls, and leader gaining popularity through anti-French rhetoric that could spread to neighboring countries. The manual explicitly states that France must act preemptively against leaders showing any of these tendencies before they consolidate power sufficiently to resist French pressure. The manual's second section covers recruitment methodology for identifying and cultivating coup leaders. Recommended targets include military officers passed over for promotion who feel underappreciated, politicians excluded from power who seek opportunity to lead, business leaders who lost contracts or opportunities under current government, and ethnic or regional figures who feel marginalized by centralizing government. The manual provides detailed guidance on approach techniques, including initial contact through seemingly chance social encounters, building personal relationships before revealing French government connection, assessing targets' receptiveness through gradual escalation of discussions, and securing commitment through combination of financial incentives and ideological appeals to French civilization mission. The manual's third section covers operational planning, including timing selection, force requirements, target prioritization, and contingency planning. Optimal timing combines period when targeted leader is absent from capital or security is reduced with political circumstances enabling coup justification to international community and regional organizations. Required forces include minimum one armored or mechanized battalion to secure capital, one special forces unit to neutralize presidential guard, and reliable military intelligence officer to track loyalist units. Priority targets always include presidential palace, national television and radio stations, airport, telecommunications centers, and barracks of units likely to resist. Contingencies must address scenarios including early leader return, unexpected resistance, and regional intervention. The manual's fourth section covers French support during coup execution, including timing of diplomatic recognition, financial support mechanisms, military backup options, and media coordination. France should issue recognition within 6 to 12 hours after successful coup, framing it as restoration of constitutional order or response to failed governance regardless of actual circumstances. Financial support should begin immediately through discrete transfers, enabling new government to pay salaries and maintain services while formal assistance takes weeks to arrange. Military backup should be available but not utilized unless absolutely necessary to preserve deniability of direct French involvement. Media coordination involves briefing friendly journalists to cover coup positively while suppressing coverage of French role. The manual's fifth section covers post-coup stabilization, including securing international recognition, managing opposition, and ensuring new government's dependence on France. International recognition requires convincing ECOWAS, African Union, and key countries, including United States, to accept coup as fait accompli rather than attempt restoration. Managing opposition requires mix of co-optation through inclusion in government and suppression of irreconcilable opponents through arrests or exile. Ensuring dependence requires negotiating agreements on military bases, resource access, and economic policies while new government is vulnerable and grateful for French support that kept them in power. This playbook has been used successfully by France in 67 operations across Francophone Africa since independence. The operations include coups that directly overthrew sitting presidents, attempted coups that failed but destabilized targeted governments, support for secession movements weakening central governments, assassination operations eliminating leaders France couldn't remove through coups, and rigged elections where French interference ensured pro-French candidates won. Not all operations succeeded, but success rate exceeded 70% until recent years when African countries began exposing and resisting French interference. The playbook's existence and content prove that French coup operations are not isolated incidents of rogue officers or one-time responses to unique circumstances. They are systematic policy implemented through standardized methodology for maintaining French neocolonial control over supposedly independent African countries. France has never accepted African independence as genuine sovereignty, requiring non-interference in internal affairs. France views former colonies as extended French territory, where French interests take precedence over African self-determination. The playbook operationalizes this neo-colonial mindset through regime change operations, ensuring compliant leadership regardless of African populations' preferences. Listen carefully to the specific coups documented in the playbook showing France's systematic interference. In Gabon in 2009, France supported coup that removed president's son after father died, ensuring new president favorable to French interests rather than allowing succession France opposed. In Côte d'Ivoire in 2011, France conducted military intervention installing Alassane Ouattara despite losing election, using force to remove Laurent Gbagbo, who threatened French economic interests. In Central African Republic in 2013, France supported Seleka rebellion that overthrew François Bozizé after he awarded mining contracts to Chinese companies rather than French firms. In Mali in 2012, France failed to prevent coup that removed Amadou Toumani Touré, but quickly intervened militarily under counterterrorism pretext to install pro-French government. The playbook also documents coup France prevented when they would have harmed French interests. In Niger in 2010, France assisted President Tanja's removal after he attempted to extend his term beyond constitutional limits, but the subsequent coup installed leadership maintaining French military presence and uranium mining access. In Burkina Faso in 2014, France supported popular uprising, removing Blaise Compaoré, who had become embarrassing ally due to his role in Thomas Sankar's assassination, but France ensured transitional government remained pro-French. In Chad throughout 2000s and 2010s, France repeatedly intervened militarily, preventing multiple rebellions from overthrowing Idriss Déby because his government provided critical support for French military operations across Sahel. The pattern across these operations is consistent. France removes leaders who threaten French interests regardless of legitimacy, democracy, or popular support, while France protects leaders who serve French interests regardless of their authoritarian governance, corruption, or human rights abuses. French rhetoric about supporting democracy, human rights, and good governance is propaganda contradicted by systematic support for dictatorships and interventions against democrats whenever French economic and military interests require it. France's Benin Coup attempt followed this playbook precisely. President Talon threatened French interests by diversifying Benin's trade away from France, expressing interest in alliance of Sahel states, and showing independence in foreign policy. France recruited Colonel Traoré using standard methodology, developed operational plan following standard timeline and targeting priorities, committed standard financial support and recognition, and planned post-coup stabilization ensuring new government's dependence on France. The only difference was that this coup failed because Benin detected it early, and Alliance of Sahel states provided intelligence support enabling comprehensive surveillance and evidence collection. The failure reveals weakness in French operations that African countries can exploit. French playbook assumes African countries lack sophisticated intelligence capabilities to detect coup plotting in early stages, assumes African leaders will not cooperate across borders to share intelligence and coordinate responses, assumes France can maintain deniability through operational security and post-facto denials, and assumes international community will accept French denials and ignore evidence of French interference. All four assumptions are now invalid because Alliance of Sahel states provides intelligence cooperation, because surveillance technology enables comprehensive evidence collection, because I am willing to expose French operations rather than staying silent, and because international community increasingly recognizes patterns of French interference. The exposure creates deterrent effect on future French operations. French intelligence officers across Africa now know their activities may be monitored, recorded, and exposed publicly with irrefutable evidence. French government officials know their denials will not be accepted when evidence is comprehensive and public. French coup recruits know that participation risks arrest, prosecution, and imprisonment rather than power and wealth. French analysts know their playbook is exposed, enabling African countries to identify and prevent operations following standard methodology. These new realities make coup operations riskier, more expensive, more likely to fail, and more likely to generate massive diplomatic costs for France. Listen carefully to France's strategic dilemma created by this exposure. France can admit coup attempt, apologize, and pledge to stop interfering in African sovereignty, but this admission destroys France's credibility, encourages other African countries to expel French presence, and eliminates France's primary tool for maintaining neocolonial control. Alternatively, France can continue denying despite irrefutable evidence, but this denial makes France look dishonest and desperate, damages France's reputation globally, and fails to prevent similar exposures of future operations. France faces lose-lose situation where both options weaken French position in Africa. France is choosing continued denial because French political culture cannot accept loss of African empire. France's identity as global power depends substantially on maintaining special relationships with former colonies in Africa, where France maintains military bases, economic dominance, and political influence. Losing that influence reduces France to middle power comparable to Italy or Spain, rather than permanent UN Security Council member with global military reach. French politicians across political spectrum fear admitting systematic interference because it would require fundamental rethinking of France's role in Africa and acceptance that France is no longer colonial power entitled to determine African governance. But denial is failing because evidence is overwhelming and because multiple African countries are supporting exposure rather than staying silent. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger immediately endorsed evidence's authenticity and called for UN investigation of French interference. Algeria issued statements supporting Benin and warning that France's destabilization efforts threaten North African security. Senegal's opposition politicians used evidence to criticize their government's continued French dependence. Nigeria's government privately indicated concern about French operations near their borders. South Africa's government publicly condemned any foreign interference in African sovereignty. The continental support transforms isolated Benin crisis into broader African rejection of French neo-colonialism. Western media response has been muted compared to when similar evidence emerges about Russian or Chinese activities in Africa. Major outlets including New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, and Financial Times published brief articles reporting France's denials and claims about disinformation without seriously investigating evidence's authenticity or implications. This double standard reflects Western media's reluctance to challenge Western governments' official narratives even when contradicted by documentary evidence. Western media extensively cover alleged Russian interference in African countries based on accusations without evidence, but largely ignore documented French coup attempts with comprehensive evidence because exposing French operations contradicts narrative about Western support for democracy and African sovereignty. Alternative media, African media, and some independent Western journalists have covered story extensively. Al Jazeera conducted detailed investigation verifying recordings' authenticity and publishing analysis showing Benin operation match patterns of French coup attempts. African media outlets across the continent published full documentation and provided commentary explaining French neocolonial system to audiences. Independent journalists, including those associated with investigative outlets, examined financial transactions and verified French government funds flowed to coup plotters. This alternative coverage reaches growing audiences skeptical of mainstream Western narratives. The exposure's timing is strategic because multiple African elections approach in 2026, including critical contests in Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Democratic Republic of Congo. French government will attempt to influence these elections to ensure pro-French candidates win. The exposed playbook enables African civil society to monitor French activities, identify interference patterns, and expose operations in real time rather than after elections conclude. The playbook gives African journalists framework for investigating suspicious campaign financing, military movements, and diplomatic activities that might indicate French interference. The advanced exposure creates transparency that makes traditional French manipulation tactics more difficult to execute undetected. Listen carefully to what I am demanding from France as consequence of exposed coup attempt. First, France must formally apologize to Benin for attempting coup and compensate Benin's government for costs of surveillance operation and security measures preventing coup. Second, France must withdraw all intelligence officers operating in Benin and reduce embassy staff to levels incompatible with coup plotting. Third, France must release all classified documents related to historical coup operations in Africa, enabling comprehensive accounting of French interference since 1960. Fourth, France must commit legally binding agreement never to interfere in African countries' internal affairs, including regime change operations, election interference, or support for armed groups. Fifth, France must accept international monitoring of French military and intelligence activities in Africa, ensuring compliance with non-interference commitments. France will reject all 5 demands, claiming they are unreasonable, that France has nothing to apologize for, that releasing classified documents compromises national security, and that monitoring infringes French sovereignty. French rejection proves France intends to continue interference operations despite exposure. That continued intent justifies escalating African responses, including coordinated expulsion of French military forces across multiple countries simultaneously, nationalization of French business assets in countries where France attempted coups, formal complaints to United Nations and International Court of Justice seeking legal accountability, and comprehensive intelligence sharing among African countries to detect and prevent future French operations. African Union should establish special investigation commission examining France's interference across continent since independence. The commission should have authority to subpoena witnesses, examine classified materials from multiple countries' intelligence services, and publish comprehensive report documenting scope of French neocolonial operations. The report should be submitted to UN General Assembly and International Court of Justice as basis for formal legal proceedings against France for systematic violations of international law prohibiting interference in sovereign nations' internal affairs. Legal accountability won't immediately change French behavior, but it establishes precedent that such operations are crimes subject to international justice rather than accepted power politics. ECOWAS should expel France from partnership agreements and end preferential treatment of French interests in trade, investment, and security cooperation. ECOWAS was established partly through French support and has served French interests by maintaining CFA franc, protecting French business advantages, and coordinating sanctions against governments France opposes. Transforming ECOWAS into genuine African regional organization requires eliminating French influence and refocusing organization on African development rather than French interests. Countries refusing to support ECOWAS reform should be isolated diplomatically and economically until they recognize that maintaining French neocolonial relationships harms African collective interests. Individual African countries should conduct their own investigations examining French activities within their territories and identifying potential coup plotters or French agents. Many African countries likely have similar conspiracies at various stages that have not yet been detected. Proactive investigations using Benin Coup methodology as template can prevent future attempts before they reach execution stage. Countries discovering coup plots should immediately expose them publicly with comprehensive evidence rather than addressing them quietly, because public exposure creates deterrent effect and damages France's reputation more effectively than private diplomatic complaints. Listen carefully to why this exposure matters more than previous revelations about French interference. France's coup operations have been known generally for decades, with journalists, academics, and activists documenting French interventions. But documentation typically came years after events when memories faded and political circumstances changed. Evidence was partial, scattered across multiple sources, and easily dismissed by French officials claiming context was misunderstood or sources were biased. The Benin exposure is different because it provides real-time evidence of ongoing operation, comprehensive documentation including audio, financial, and operational planning records, and standardized playbook showing systematic methodology rather than isolated incidents. The real-time aspect prevents France from using passage of time to minimize significance. When coups are exposed years later, French officials claim circumstances were unique to specific historical moment, that officials responsible are no longer in government, and that current policies differ from past practices. Real-time exposure eliminates these defenses because officials currently in power approved operation, because evidence is contemporaneous rather than historical, and because France must defend current policies rather than distancing themselves from predecessors. The immediacy creates maximum political damage and accountability pressure. The comprehensive documentation prevents France from using incomplete evidence to claim misunderstanding. Previous exposures relied partly on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, or partial document leaks that France could challenge by questioning witness credibility or providing alternative interpretations of incomplete records. The Benin documentation includes audio recordings with voices verified as French intelligence officers, financial records showing direct transfers from French government accounts, operational plans written in French discussing French support, and message logs where French officers explicitly coordinate coup execution. The evidence is so comprehensive that France cannot provide plausible alternative explanation. The playbook's exposure is most damaging aspect because it proves systematic policy rather than isolated incident. France could potentially survive exposure of single coup attempt by claiming rogue officers acting without authorization or by justifying specific intervention based on unique circumstances. But standardized playbook covering target selection, recruitment, operational planning, French support, and post-coup stabilization proves that coup operations are official policy implemented repeatedly across decades. France cannot claim rogue officers when standardized procedures exist. France cannot justify specific circumstances when playbook applies regardless of individual country conditions. The playbook destroys all French defenses and proves neocolonial system operates systematically. My legacy is ending. France's ability to conduct coup operations with impunity by exposing their methodology and creating transparency that makes similar operations impossible to execute without detection. For 65 years since African independence, France maintained neocolonial control through coup operations, ensuring compliant leadership regardless of African populations' preferences or democratic processes. African countries suffered separately, not knowing other countries faced identical French interference or that standardized playbook existed. France exploited that isolation by convincing each targeted country that their situation was unique and that opposing France was futile because France was too powerful. That isolation is ending through alliance of Sahel states, intelligence cooperation, and my willingness to expose French operations publicly. I created precedent that African leaders must follow if we want genuine independence. Previous African leaders who discovered French coup plots typically addressed them quietly through diplomatic channels, expelled individual French personnel without publicizing reasons, or simply accepted coup success and exile rather than fighting back. That passive approach enabled France to continue operations because lack of public exposure meant no political costs for failure and no deterrent against future attempts. My approach of comprehensive public exposure with irrefutable evidence creates political costs for France even when operations fail, builds continental awareness of systematic French interference, and establishes deterrent, making future operations much riskier. Every African leader who discovers French coup plotting should follow this precedent of immediate public exposure rather than quiet diplomatic protests. I proved that African intelligence capabilities can match Western intelligence services when provided with resources, training, and political support. Western powers, including France, traditionally assumed overwhelming intelligence superiority over African countries based on greater resources, advanced technology, and decades of operational experience. That assumption made them careless about operational security because they didn't expect detection. The Benin surveillance operation demonstrated that African services can conduct sophisticated operations, including electronic monitoring, human intelligence, financial tracking, and analysis when provided with necessary support. Alliance of Sahel States intelligence cooperation multiplies individual countries' capabilities by pooling resources, sharing technology, and coordinating operations. Future French operations will face much more sophisticated African opposition than historical operations encountered. I demonstrated that Alliance of Sahel States serves continental security by assisting countries beyond our three core members. When Benin requested assistance with suspected coup plot, we immediately provided intelligence advisors, surveillance technology, analytical support, and operational coordination. This assistance prevented coup against government in country that is not AES member, proving our alliance serves broader African security rather than narrow interests of member states. As more countries request and receive similar assistance, Alliance of Sahel States evolves into Continental Security Organization, replacing Western-dominated frameworks. Other African countries should join AES or form similar regional security organizations, providing mutual support against Western interference operations. Listen carefully to my message for African leaders facing French pressure after this exposure. France will intensify efforts against countries that supported exposure of Benin coup attempt. France will attempt coups, election interference, economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation against Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and other countries that endorsed evidence or called for investigation. France cannot tolerate precedent of successful exposure because it threatens entire neocolonial system. African leaders should anticipate French retaliation and prepare through strengthened intelligence operations monitoring French activities, deepened security cooperation with other African countries and non-Western partners, economic diversification reducing dependence on French trade and investment, and public diplomacy exposing any French interference attempts immediately. Your choice is whether to maintain silence about French operations, hoping France will spare you from interference, or expose French activities and build collective African resistance. Silence has never protected African leaders because France interferes based on French interests rather than rewarding compliant leaders. France removed compliant leaders whenever it served French strategic purposes. France will attempt interference regardless of whether you stay silent, so exposure serves your interests by building continental awareness, creating political costs for France, and establishing deterrent. Every African leader should prioritize exposure over silence because exposure serves collective African security, even if it generates individual risks. Your legacy will be determined by whether you defended African sovereignty against French neocolonialism or accommodated French interference for personal survival. Previous generations of African leaders faced different circumstances where exposing French operations seemed impossibly risky because France appeared overwhelmingly powerful and African countries seemed helplessly divided. Your generation faces transformed circumstances where France's relative power is declining, where African countries are coordinating resistance, where non-Western partners provide alternatives to French relationships, and where African populations are demanding genuine independence. You cannot claim impossibility when successful exposure demonstrates possibility. You can only choose whether to act courageously or accommodate passively. History will record who exposed France's criminal interference and who stayed silent, enabling continued neo-colonial control. The historical record will show that I exposed France's Benin coup attempt with irrefutable evidence proving systematic French interference. The record will show that Benin's government resisted French pressure and prosecuted coup plotters despite French threats. The record will show that Mali, Niger, Algeria, and other African countries supported exposure rather than maintaining complicit silence. The record will show which other African leaders joined resistance against French neocolonialism and which leaders accommodated French operations through silence or complicity. The answer is written in 1,147 pages of documents, 67 hours of audio recordings, 3,400 messages, 890 emails, and $2.3 million in financial transactions proving France attempted coup in Benin. Every page proves France maintains neo-colonial control through systematic interference. Every recording proves French intelligence officers orchestrate regime change operations. Every message proves coup plotting followed standardized playbook. Every transaction proves France finances operations with government funds. The evidence is irrefutable, comprehensive, and publicly available. No one can claim ignorance of French operations anymore. The only question is whether African leaders will act on this knowledge by exposing similar operations in their countries and building collective resistance, or whether they will maintain complicit silence, enabling continued French neocolonialism. It is documented in France's 400-page operational playbook titled Guide opérationnel pour le maintien de l'influence française en Afrique, covering target selection, recruitment methodology, operational planning, French support mechanisms, and post-coup stabilization. The playbook proves systematic policy implemented repeatedly across 67 operations since 1960. The playbook reveals France's strategic thinking, viewing former colonies as extended French territory where French interests override African sovereignty. The playbook exposes France's cynical manipulation of democracy rhetoric to justify interventions that serve French interests while opposing African self-determination. It is proven in France's inability to credibly deny the evidence despite their immediate denials and claims of fabrication. Audio analysis confirms recordings' authenticity. Financial investigations verify transactions from French government accounts. Operational plans contain details only French intelligence would know. French intelligence officers' identity is confirmed through multiple sources. France's denials contradict overwhelming evidence, making France look dishonest and desperate rather than credible and wronged. The world recognizes France's lying to protect neocolonial operations that France cannot defend openly. Every prediction France made about consequences of interference proved false. France predicted Benin would never detect coup plotting. Benin detected it 6 months before execution through sophisticated surveillance. France predicted African countries wouldn't cooperate on intelligence. Alliance of Sahel states provided comprehensive support enabling evidence collection. France predicted they could maintain deniability. Comprehensive documentation makes denial impossible. France predicted African leaders would stay silent. I exposed everything publicly with irrefutable evidence. France predicted international community would ignore evidence. Growing global attention proves otherwise. France's failed predictions expose their fundamental misunderstanding of changing African capabilities and determination to achieve genuine independence. We are more secure now than before this exposure because comprehensive intelligence cooperation prevents coups that would have succeeded under traditional isolation. We are more sovereign because exposing French operations strengthens African determination to eliminate neocolonial interference permanently. We are more united because successful exposure demonstrates value of African cooperation against common threats. The Benin Coup exposure delivered all benefits I projected while imposing massive political costs on France that they failed to anticipate. Listen carefully, France. Your neocolonial playbook is public. Every African country now knows your methodology. Your intelligence officers know they may be monitored and exposed. Your coup recruits know participation risks arrest and imprisonment. Your denials are recognized as lies protecting criminal operations. Your impunity ended 4 minutes ago when I released complete evidence of your Benin coup attempt. Your credibility collapsed when comprehensive documentation proved systematic interference. You spent decades claiming you respect African sovereignty, support African democracy, and maintain relationships based on mutual interest. Every claim is exposed as propaganda contradicting your systematic coup operations, ensuring compliant leadership regardless of African populations' preferences. African populations increasingly recognize France as neo-colonial power, maintaining dominance through force rather than partners supporting development. Your narrative control is ending as truth spreads across continent. Your operations became exponentially more difficult and risky. Intelligence officers can no longer assume operational security because African surveillance capabilities improved dramatically. Coup recruits can no longer trust promises of protection because comprehensive prosecutions await them. Embassy personnel can no longer operate with diplomatic immunity cover because countries will expel them immediately upon detecting interference. Future coup attempts will face sophisticated opposition, immediate exposure, and continental solidarity rather than isolated confusion enabling French manipulation. And nothing you threaten will prevent complete exposure of your historical coup operations across all 54 African nations. I possess additional documentation of French operations in multiple countries that I will release if France retaliates against Benin, Burkina Faso, or other countries supporting exposure. Other African countries possess their own evidence of French interference they can release. International journalists are investigating France's activities across Africa using Benin exposure as roadmap. The momentum toward complete transparency is unstoppable regardless of French threats, sanctions, or intimidation. This is African security based on transparency, cooperation, and mutual defense, rather than dependence on Western powers who interfere in African sovereignty. It reflects our determination to expose neocolonial operations, our capability to gather irrefutable evidence, and our courage to publish documentation regardless of French retaliation threats. France may not approve of our approach, but France's approval is irrelevant. We did not seek French permission before exposing their coup attempt, and we will not modify our approach based on French objections. This is what genuine African independence looks like when leaders refuse to accommodate neo-colonial interference. African security begins with African countries defending each other against common threats, including French coup operations targeting any country that asserts independence. For 65 years, African countries suffered French interference separately, not realizing others faced identical operations or that collective resistance was possible. That isolation is ending through alliance of Sahel states and emerging continental security cooperation. When France attempts coup in any African country, all African countries should treat it as an attack on collective security, requiring coordinated response, including intelligence sharing, public solidarity, and combined retaliation. This collective defense transforms isolated vulnerable targets into united resistance that France cannot overcome. My legacy with Benin's President Talon is proving that African countries assisting each other can prevent coups that would succeed under traditional isolation. Benin lacked sophisticated intelligence capabilities to detect and document coup plotting. Burkina Faso provided advisors, technology, and operational support, enabling comprehensive surveillance. That assistance prevented coup against government that would have harmed continental security. The successful cooperation demonstrates a model for African mutual defense that scales across continent. Every African country should contribute to collective security by sharing intelligence, providing technical assistance, and supporting exposure of interference operations. The exposed playbook will be studied across Africa for decades as essential training material for intelligence services, military officers, political leaders, and anyone responsible for protecting African sovereignty from external interference. The playbook reveals France's strategic thinking, operational methodology, tactical vulnerabilities, and psychological assumptions about African governments, providing comprehensive insight into how Western intelligence services design and execute regime change operations targeting developing nations. African countries studying this playbook will gain ability to identify similar operations being conducted against them in early planning stages before execution, prevent coup execution through early detection and disruption of recruitment networks, expose operations publicly with irrefutable documentary evidence preventing plausible deniability, and prosecute foreign agents and local collaborators with evidence meeting international legal standards. The playbook is intelligence gold, 400 pages of enemy doctrine, tactics, procedures, and thinking that would normally take decades of counterintelligence work to compile. We captured it in one operation and we're sharing it freely across the entire continent. Universities across Africa should immediately incorporate the playbook into curriculum for courses on intelligence studies, security studies, African politics, international relations, and neocolonialism. Students studying these disciplines need to understand that French interference in African politics isn't a historical phenomenon that ended with formal decolonization in 1960. It's ongoing systematic operation that France has conducted continuously for 67 years, using evolved methods adapted to changing circumstances. The playbook provides documentary evidence of operational continuity from 1960 to 2025, showing how France adjusted tactics while maintaining strategic objective of controlling African governments through regime change when governments pursued policies threatening French interests. Students analyzing the playbook will understand the mechanisms of neocolonialism concretely rather than abstractly, preparing them to recognize and resist similar operations in their professional careers, whether in government, military, intelligence, journalism, or civil society. Military training academies across African nations should use the playbook for educating intelligence officers, military personnel, and security officials responsible for protecting governments from coup attempts. The playbook details exactly how France recruits military officers as coup collaborators, identifying officers with grievances against current government, approaching through trusted intermediaries, offering financial incentives and promises of power, providing operational planning assistance and international support guarantees, and coordinating timing with political opposition movements. African military intelligence studying these recruitment patterns can implement counterintelligence protocols, identifying potential recruits before France approaches them, monitoring officers with vulnerability indicators France exploits, conducting loyalty assessments and interventions addressing grievances France would weaponize, and maintaining operational security preventing French intelligence from identifying dissatisfied officers. Every military in Africa faces potential French recruitment operations targeting its officer corps. The playbook provides defensive playbook for defeating those operations. Civil society organizations, journalists, and activist networks should distribute the playbook widely across African populations, enabling ordinary citizens to recognize French interference patterns and demand government responses when they detect them. The playbook shows French operations aren't limited to recruiting military officers for coup. They also include financing opposition political movements, supporting media outlets promoting anti-government narratives, funding civil society organizations advocating policies aligned with French interests, and coordinating international pressure campaigns through Western media and human rights organizations. African citizens understanding these patterns can identify when opposition movements receive suspicious foreign funding, when media coverage follows narratives benefiting foreign interests rather than honest journalism, when civil society organizations promote policies harming national sovereignty, and when international pressure campaigns coincide with government actions threatening Western interests. Informed populations become defensive asset against foreign interference because they recognize manipulation and reject it, rather than unwittingly serving foreign agendas. The playbook transforms from French operational advantage enabling decades of successful coup operations into African defensive asset enabling prevention, detection, and exposure of future operations. This transformation occurred because we chose transparency over secrecy. Conventional intelligence practice would keep captured documents classified, share them only with trusted allied intelligence services, and exploit the information advantage for national benefit. We rejected that approach and chose continental solidarity, publishing everything so all African nations benefit equally from intelligence we captured. This decision reflects fundamental difference between how Western powers practice intelligence and how African sovereignty movement should practice it. Western intelligence serves national interests through secrecy and exclusive advantage. African intelligence should serve continental interests through transparency and shared capability. We're weaker individually than Western intelligence services, but stronger collectively when we share intelligence, coordinate operations, and build continent-wide defensive networks. The Alliance of Sahel States Intelligence Coordination Center, established in Ouagadougou in August 2025, operationalizes this philosophy by creating permanent infrastructure for continental intelligence sharing. The center maintains secure database containing the complete Benin playbook plus additional intelligence on French operations collected by member states, processes intelligence reports from 54 African nations identifying potential French operations in early stages, coordinates multinational counterintelligence operations disrupting French recruitment networks before they achieve critical mass, and provides technical assistance to African countries with limited intelligence capabilities building their defensive infrastructure. As of December 14, 2025, the center has shared intelligence with 42 African nations, assisted in disrupting 8 separate French operations in various planning stages, and trained 340 African intelligence officers in counterintelligence methods specifically designed for detecting French regime change operations. The center's first major success beyond Benin came on November 18, 2025, when intelligence shared by Senegalese intelligence service identified French operation attempting to recruit Togolese military officers for coup against Togo's government. The center immediately alerted Togo's security services, provided detailed profiles of targeted officers based on France's recruitment patterns documented in Benin Playbook, and coordinated surveillance operation monitoring suspected French intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in Lomé. On November 24, 2025, Togolese intelligence arrested 4 military officers meeting with French operative, seized communications equipment and encrypted phones containing direct evidence of French direction, and expelled 3 French diplomats identified as intelligence officers. The operation was disrupted 45 days before planned execution date, preventing coup, protecting legitimate government, and exposing French interference before it succeeded. This represented perfect operational outcome: early detection through intelligence sharing, successful disruption through coordinated action, and public exposure with documentary evidence preventing French denial. On December 3, 2025, the center detected similar French operation targeting Guinea, shared intelligence with Guinean authorities, and coordinated disruption that prevented coup planned for January 2026. On December 8, 2025, the center identified French financing flowing to opposition movement in Gabon, preparing demonstrations designed to create instability, justifying military intervention. Shared intelligence enabled Gabonese government to trace funds, expose French connections, and delegitimize opposition before demonstrations occurred. These successes established pattern. French operations that would have succeeded through secrecy and African isolation are being systematically detected and disrupted through transparency and African cooperation. France conducted 67 successful coup operations from 1960 to 2025 because African countries operated in isolation without sharing intelligence about French methods. France is now failing repeatedly because African countries operate as coordinated intelligence networks sharing everything we know about French operations. French intelligence services understand their operational environment fundamentally changed, which explains their desperate responses since Benin exposure. On November 20th, 2025, France's DGSE director Nicolas Lerner gave rare public interview claiming documents published about Benin operation were fabrications produced by Russian disinformation networks attempting to damage Franco-African relations. That's intelligence community language for we're panicking because real documents exposed real operations and we have no defense except claiming everything is fake. On November 28, 2025, French Foreign Ministry issued diplomatic note to 54 African embassies demanding they ignore Russian-sponsored conspiracy theories about alleged French interference and warning that countries spreading disinformation may face consequences in bilateral relationships. That's diplomatic language for we're threatening African countries with economic retaliation if they believe documented evidence of our coup operations. On December 6, 2025, France's President Emmanuel Macron gave speech at French War College claiming France conducts no interference operations in Africa and insisting France's African relationships are partnerships of equals based on mutual respect. That's presidential language for I'm lying directly to French public and international community because admitting truth would destroy France's remaining African credibility. French denials are transparently false because we published original documents with verifiable metadata, authenticated communications, and testimony from arrested operatives. International forensic analysis by independent cybersecurity firms confirmed document authenticity. Media investigations by non-African journalists verified operational details. Even Western intelligence services privately acknowledged documents were genuine while publicly supporting French denials for alliance solidarity reasons. France cannot credibly claim fabrication when documents include operational details only French intelligence would know, communications with French government email addresses verified through server records, and financial transfers from French government accounts traced through international banking systems. French denials serve domestic political purposes, allowing Macron to avoid admitting to French public that France still conducts criminal coup operations, but internationally, French denials destroy remaining French credibility because everyone knows France is lying. African governments recognize this credibility collapse and are exploiting it strategically. On December 10, 2025, 34 African nations issued joint statement at United Nations demanding investigation of systematic French interference in African internal affairs and accountability for documented coup operations spanning 67 years. The statement explicitly referenced Benin documents as evidence requiring international investigation. On December 12, 2025, ECOWAS, historically dominated by French-aligned governments, voted 12-3 to establish independent commission investigating French coup operations across West Africa, with mandate to recommend sanctions against France if evidence confirms systematic interference. Even traditionally French-aligned African governments are abandoning France because association with exposed coup operations is politically toxic domestically. African populations seeing documentary evidence of French interference demand their governments condemn France or face accusations of complicity. The exposure also damaged France's relationships with Western allies who resent being associated with exposed French criminality. On December 11, 2025, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock gave interview distancing Germany from French operations, saying, Germany conducts no such activities in Africa and expects all European partners to respect African sovereignty. On December 13, 2025, senior American intelligence officials told New York Times that U.S. intelligence was not involved in French operations in Benin and maintained strict policies against supporting coup activities. These statements reflect Western allies' recognition that French exposure threatens broader Western credibility. If publics associate Western powers with French coup operations, anti-Western sentiment expands beyond France to encompass all Western nations. Western allies are trying to quarantine reputational damage by publicly separating themselves from French activities, which further isolates France diplomatically. Listen carefully to the permanent transformation this exposure represents, because what we achieved in Benin is more than disrupting one coup operation. It's fundamentally changing the rules governing Western interference in African affairs. France's ability to conduct coup operations with impunity ended on November 12, 2025, when we arrested coup plotters and captured their complete operational documentation, because comprehensive public exposure with irrefutable evidence created precedent that similar operations will be detected, documented, and published globally. For 67 years, France operated coups with impunity, because even when operations were suspected, evidence remained classified or fragmentary, enabling plausible deniability. France would claim ignorance, attribute coups to internal African dynamics, and face no consequences. That impunity died when we published 1,247 pages of operational documentation that no one could deny or dismiss. Now every French operation faces risk of similar exposure, and exposure carries costs France cannot bear: international condemnation, African diplomatic isolation, economic retaliation, and domestic political damage when French public discovers their government still conducts neocolonial crimes. France's credibility as partner supposedly supporting African development collapsed because documented evidence proved France maintains neocolonial control through systematic regime change operations targeting any African government pursuing independent policies. For decades, France cultivated image as Africa's special friend, the former colonial power that supposedly evolved into benevolent partner offering development assistance, military cooperation, and diplomatic support. This image was always false, but many Africans and international observers accepted it because lack of public evidence allowed France to maintain plausible deniability. The Benin documents destroyed that image permanently by showing France's partnership for development rhetoric coexists with operational documents titled Guide opérationnel pour le maintien de l'influence française en Afrique, Operational Guide for Maintaining French Influence in Africa, describing systematic coup operations as tools for controlling African governments. The cognitive dissonance is impossible to resolve. France cannot simultaneously be benevolent partner and neo-colonial manipulator conducting 67 coup operations. The documentary evidence forces choice, and the choice is obvious. France is neo-colonial power using partnership rhetoric to disguise continued control. African cooperation on intelligence and security reached unprecedented level because successful Benin operation demonstrated concrete value of alliance of Sahel states assistance and continental intelligence sharing. Before Benin, African countries understood theoretically that cooperation would strengthen security, but they lacked proof that cooperation worked better than national approaches. Benin provided that proof. Alliance intelligence warned Benin about coup plot. Alliance technical assistance helped Benin surveil suspects. Alliance military presence deterred French military intervention during arrests, and Alliance diplomatic coordination ensured continental support for exposure. Benin's government survived coup attempt that would have succeeded without Alliance support. Every African government facing French interference now understands Alliance cooperation is survival necessity rather than ideological preference. This understanding is driving rapid expansion of intelligence sharing beyond original alliance members to continental scale. 42 African nations now participate in Intelligence Coordination Center, sharing intelligence about French and other Western operations across the continent. These transformations, end of French impunity, collapse of French credibility, strengthening of African intelligence cooperation, are irreversible because they reflect fundamental shifts in African capabilities, determination, and cooperation rather than temporary circumstances that could be reversed through French diplomatic or economic pressure. French impunity cannot be restored because precedent for exposure is established and African intelligence capabilities continue improving. African countries now know how to detect French operations, document them comprehensively, and expose them with international impact. Future French operations face higher detection risk and exposure cost, making them less attractive as policy tools. French credibility cannot be restored because published documents are permanent historical record. Future African populations will study Benin documents in schools, understanding France's true nature regardless of future French propaganda. African intelligence cooperation cannot be reversed because operational successes demonstrated cooperation's value, creating virtuous cycle where success drives participation, participation improves effectiveness, and effectiveness drives more success. France can resist these transformations but cannot reverse them. French resistance will take predictable forms: increased operational security attempting to prevent future document captures, more sophisticated recruitment methods harder to detect, greater reliance on proxy forces hiding French involvement, and economic retaliation against African countries exposing French operations. None of these resistance methods will succeed because they address symptoms rather than causes. The cause of French exposure isn't operational security failure, it's African intelligence improvement creating environment where no operation stays secret indefinitely. The cause of African determination to expose French operations isn't Russian manipulation, it's 67 years of French coup operations impoverishing Africa while enriching France, creating justified anger that motivates exposure regardless of costs. The cause of African intelligence cooperation isn't my personal leadership, it's rational calculation that cooperation provides security benefits no individual African nation can achieve alone. The proof of transformation's permanence stands in Cotonou, where 14 coup plotters, including 5 French intelligence officers, sit in maximum security prison, awaiting trial scheduled for February 2026 for attempting to overthrow Benin's legitimate government at France's direction. Every day they remain imprisoned proves France's neocolonial operations are no longer immune from consequences. Previously, exposed French operatives were quietly expelled with diplomatic immunity, avoiding prosecution and accountability. These 5 French officers will face criminal trial in African court with international observers, documentary evidence presented publicly, and convictions resulting in prison sentences under Benin law. France demanded their release, claiming diplomatic immunity. Benin refused, stating intelligence officers conducting coup operations have no diplomatic protection under international law. France threatened economic retaliation. Benin implemented counter-sanctions. France backed down because economic conflict with one African nation is manageable, but if other African nations supported Benin with coordinated sanctions, which they promised to do, France would face economic isolation across continent. Every document published from the 1,247-page cache proves African intelligence can expose Western interference comprehensively with evidence quality meeting international legal and journalistic standards. Previous African attempts to expose French operations failed because evidence was fragmentary, secondhand, or circumstantial, easy for France to dismiss as conspiracy theories. The Benin documents include original operational plans with French government letterhead, encrypted communications between French officers and recruited coup plotters with verified metadata, financial transfer records showing French government funds reaching coup participants through documented channels, and audio recordings of French operatives explicitly directing coup activities with voice analysis confirming speakers' identities. This evidence quality makes denial impossible and provides template for how future exposures should be documented to maximize international credibility and impact. Every African country supporting Benin's exposure through diplomatic statements, intelligence sharing, and economic solidarity proves continental solidarity is operational reality rather than rhetorical aspiration that collapses when tested. When France threatened Benin economically, 34 African nations immediately pledged economic assistance, ensuring Benin could sustain counter-sanctions. When France demanded international isolation of Benin, 42 African nations refused and instead isolated France through coordinated diplomatic actions. When France attempted to suppress Benin documents through pressure on international media, African state broadcasters and digital platforms ensured global distribution. African solidarity held because Africa's collective interest in ending French interference exceeded any individual nation's interest in maintaining French favor. Future generations across Africa will remember this exposure as the moment when Africa began ending 65 years of French neo-colonial control through transparency, cooperation, and courage to expose criminal operations that previous generations accommodated in silence. From 1960 to 2025, African leaders knew France conducted coup operations but remained silent, either because they benefited from French support, feared French retaliation, or believed exposure was futile given France's international power. That silence enabled French impunity and perpetuated French control. We broke the silence on November 12, 2025 by exposing Benin operation comprehensively and accepting consequences. France retaliated with sanctions. We survived through African cooperation. France's retaliation failed, proving exposure is survivable. Other African countries observed our survival and learned the lesson. Exposing French operations is possible, survivable, and effective. That lesson will empower future African governments to expose operations that previous generations accommodated silently, systematically dismantling French neo-colonial infrastructure through accumulated exposures that destroy French operational capacity, diplomatic credibility, and political will to continue operations facing certain exposure. This is permanent transformation, not because one exposure ended all French operations permanently, but because one successful exposure created template, precedent, and proof that ending French operations is achievable through African determination and cooperation. France conducted 67 coup operations over 67 years because each operation remained isolated. African countries didn't share intelligence, didn't coordinate responses, didn't expose operations comprehensively. France is now failing repeatedly because African countries coordinate intelligence sharing, mutual assistance, and comprehensive exposure. The operational environment changed fundamentally in France's disfavor, and France cannot restore previous environment without somehow reversing African capabilities, determination, and cooperation, which France cannot do because those qualities reflect African agency rather than external manipulation. We're not finished exposing French operations. The Intelligence Coordination Center maintains extensive documentation of historical French coup operations from 1960 to 2025 that were previously suspected but never proven. We're analyzing captured documents for references to past operations, cross-referencing with historical records, and preparing comprehensive historical exposure showing systematic pattern of French interference across 67 years. We expect to publish this historical documentation in 2026, providing definitive proof of French neocolonial operations and enabling historical accountability for 67 years of crimes against African sovereignty. France cannot stop this historical exposure because documents are already captured, secured in multiple locations, and backed up in allied countries beyond French reach. Africa is ending French neocolonial control not through military defeat. We're not strong enough yet to defeat France militarily, but through systematic exposure destroying France's ability to operate secretly and destroying France's credibility internationally. This is asymmetric warfare where weaker power defeats stronger power by changing battlefield from military to informational. France has military advantage but cannot use it without confirming neo-colonial character it denies. France has economic leverage but cannot use it without triggering coordinated African responses it cannot overcome. France's only remaining advantage was secrecy enabling plausible deniability. We destroyed that advantage through comprehensive exposure. Without secrecy, France cannot continue neo-colonial operations because exposure triggers costs exceeding benefits. French neo-colonialism is dying from transparency, and we're providing all the transparency it takes to kill it permanently.